Good afternoon from London. My name is Vikas Pota, and I use this opportunity to have conversations with friends from all over the world. And whenever I've had these conversations and I recount them to others, they always say, I wish I could have been a fly on the wall. So now technology allows us to do this, where we have these conversations and you can watch this interaction and engage with it on the social media platforms. So we're streaming on my Facebook page, on my Twitter account, on my LinkedIn account, and I'm sure there'll be lots of people watching. Today, I wanted to focus on the subject of leadership in education. And with me, we have two friends who come from different parts of the world, but are equally engaged on the subject of leadership. We have Sameer Sampat, who is a co-founder of Global School Leaders, which incubates various leadership interventions and brings them to scale. And actually, they've published a report recently regarding the literature review that talks about what exists in the Global South. And we have Dame Alison Peacock, who is the Chief Executive of the Chartered College of Teaching in the UK, and a previous head teacher in own right and teacher. Alison, welcome to this conversation. For this live stream, what I wanted to do first was, Alison, to speak to you a little bit about you having been a teacher, ascended the ladder and hierarchy to become a head teacher, and now you're in this role where you're trying to encourage teachers to up their game, but also improve the status of the profession. Tell us a little bit, before you tell us about the Chartered College, tell us what the situation with education in England is today. It seems appropriate to ask you that question.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to have this conversation with you. That's a really huge question, isn't it? The state of education in England today. So there's a range of views about education. It's interesting, isn't it, that we've just had a report published in the last 24 hours that says our young people are amongst the unhappiest certainly in Europe, potentially in the world. So one has to worry about where education has an impact on the well-being of our youngsters. We also know that many of our teachers, certainly prior to the pandemic, were choosing not to stay within the profession. So it's not that everything is perfect by any means at all. If you listen to the politicians, I suspect they would say that standards are higher than they've ever been. And it's true to say that our students and teachers are working incredibly hard. In terms of inspection output, in terms of the vast majority of schools are judged to be good or better. And yet, when the pandemic struck and everything changed, I think there are some things that people would say, we need to learn from this experience. And this was about learning from pausing the whole experience of being on that treadmill of going to school, constantly trying to prove that what you're doing is good enough for someone else, whether you're a child or an adult, wherever you are in the system. So lots to discuss, I think, probably.
And so when we speak about the subject of leadership, there's a great question that I want to ask both of you, I suppose, is what have you observed about the subject of leadership and the impact of the pandemic on what should be our collective priorities? I'll let Alison go first, and I'll come to you, Sameer.
Okay, so I think our school leaders have been amazing over the last number of weeks and months. They have stepped up. They've been the ones that have tried to support their communities on the front line. Of course, our schools and colleges haven't been closed. We've been open for vulnerable students and for the children of key workers. But what our school leaders have done is they've worked collaboratively. They've tried to problem solve in the best way they can. They've tried to make sure that they could offer remote learning. And this all happened so quickly, as I'm sure everybody in the world would say. None of us were expecting this. In some cases, our school leaders have been the ones that have been leading campaigns to make sure our children get fed during the school day with school closures. Some of them have actually been out on the streets with others delivering food. So there's a tremendous amount they've done. And they've also had to try to make sense of the emerging picture. So advice from scientists, advice from government, advice from anybody, everybody's got a view about what to do next, and try and find a way through that if you can't please everybody, tries to at least please the majority and keeps everyone safe. So it's been a really hard time, I would say, but they've been brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, my friend Armand, coincidentally, whose birthday it is today, and he's in Canada, actually talks about teachers as first responders. And I think that's a really interesting use of language. But Sameer, can I ask you your views on this subject?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. I mean, just how different people and countries experience the pandemic, I think, has a lot to do with leadership at the political level. And I think how kind of parents and students experience the academic consequences has a lot to do with leadership at the school level. And so for us, that's been really clear in the countries where we work, where the leaders that have been able to really look at kind of the whole child needs. So looking at something like right now, kind of as Alison was saying, right now there's clearly emotional trauma that students are going through. They're not having the basic physical needs met. So school leaders that have been able to start with that as their main priority, and then kind of make sure the students are that's being addressed before they're moving on to the academic components, I think have been the ones that have been the most successful. And that is not always how school leaders necessarily view their role. And so that's, in a sense, it's been I think a very important reprioritization that I'm hoping even outlasts COVID.
And so, Sameer, tell us a little bit about your work at Global School Leaders.
Yeah, so we support the development of school leaders in lower and middle income countries around the world. So we have programs in India, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Kenya. And essentially what we've found is that the school leaders in this are very important to the outcomes of students in the schools, but they're given very little support currently. And so we've developed a 2-year on-the-job training program for these leaders, where they get content from our trainers. They kind of come together in groups to share learnings amongst themselves, which is actually some of the most popular parts of the program. And I'm happy to talk a lot more about that later. And they get kind of individual coaching. And this kind of happens over the course of 2 years, and then into the alumni program that happens afterwards.
I think the follow-up question I have, I think for Alison, is, Sameer and the Global School Leaders work as well as yours, and there's a lot of stuff out there that tells us that, investing in school leadership to improve quality is a great policy solution that is potentially cost effective. Why do you think it's so infrequently used?
Well, I think you're right. I think the leader makes all the difference. So just yesterday, I was talking to somebody, a teacher, and she was moving schools, and she was talking about the difference that had taken place within her group of schools, because the guy who'd previously been leading those group of schools, he'd been inspirational. Everybody had wanted to work for him. They weren't counting the hours because they bought into his ideas, they bought into his vision, they bought into the mission, and working for him, almost felt like a pleasure, if you like. And then he moved, and they got a new school leader. And the person who came in started to reintroduce all kinds of monitoring activities. And these are the kinds of things that essentially tell you, I don't trust you, I need to check up on you. So I need to monitor the quality of your lessons. I need to scrutinize the quality of your planning. I want to see. And all of these kinds of actions are following on from a leader who'd been inspirational, who'd been driven by trust, who grew that kind of, we all know what these people are like. They're people that you feel inspired to be in their company, and you want to please them, and you want to work with them. Taking that away and putting a different leader in their place, the same title, and yet so much less impact. And in fact, all of the senior leadership team had left this school within the last 12 months since this new leader took over, and 28 members of staff similarly. So it was just very stark to me. This is what happens when you get the wrong person in that really important role, and when you get the right person there, goodness me, it feels like anything could happen. You can take people anywhere if you love them, if you look after them, if you believe in them, and you listen to them, then you can create a wonderful climate, can't you, for innovation and for hard work.
Yeah, but Alison, my question was, why is it so infrequently used as a policy solution?
Well, because I think it's so little understood. I think this is the issue. I think that,
But is it not motherhood and apple pie?
I mean, one of the things we're going to do at the Chartered College is we're developing a new leadership course that starts in January. And this is going to be leadership that's not focused on management issues. It's not focused on managing your budget and sorting out your staffing and all the rest of it. Although that's important and somewhere that needs to happen. The leadership we're looking at is leadership of learning. And this is really fundamental, because if you get the right person in the job and you train them to make sure that they know how to remove barriers to learning and do the kinds of things that create the culture that I've just described, then suddenly you're in a position where schools are far more likely to be high performing and to do really well. So those are the kinds of things that are really worth investing in, but so little understood too often. We translate too much across the piece in terms of leadership.
And Alison, before I move to Sameer, tell us a little bit more about the Chartered College and what you've been doing and what you plan to do going forward.
Okay, so the Chartered College is a professional body. You can join voluntarily. It's not a union. But what we are is a professional body that is aimed at raising the status of teaching and building teacher expertise across the career of a teacher. We want to enable teachers to share their learning, to become chartered, and ultimately to be able to offer that in a global fashion, in the way that we have a global recognition of chartered accountants. If we had a chartered teacher status that people knew all over the world, then you'd know that you'd got the most fantastic teacher teaching your child, or that you could recruit to your school. So this is something that we are moving to do. We've only been in existence 3.5 years, so we're kind of the new kids on the block. Having said that, the vision is huge for what we want to achieve, and we've already got a tremendous number of colleagues who are joining us, and fellows indeed. So there's a lot to do, but events like this are really helpful in getting the word out.
And tell me, before again I go to Sameer, how many numbers of teachers actually join the Chartered College?
So at the moment, the numbers fluctuate, obviously, because there's this time of year. But we're talking in the region of now 40,000 teachers, which is a quite a significant number, given that we've only been in a short space of time. Our ambitions, though, go way beyond that. Because the more that teachers are members, the more that teachers contribute, the more that they talk about the work that we're doing, and we can share the resources that we have, everybody benefits. And ultimately, this is about the children, because this is about how do we make sure that we have the optimal teaching workforce so that our children have the best possible opportunity for the future.
Thanks a lot, Alison. Sameer, I want to ask you a question, and it sounds really easy to answer. It sounds like a very innocent question. What can a teacher do to develop into a leader?
I think the kind of core skill of the leader is what Alison was mentioning with being a leader of learning. So I think the best thing a teacher can do is actually really develop expertise in teaching and really understanding the ins and outs of what good teaching is, how to do it themselves, but also how to identify it in other people. And we're finding with the leaders that we work with, that lens, that instructional lens, is kind of, though the leaders that have those are the most effective at improving outcomes for students. So I would say that is kind of core number one. So in some sense, it's just kind of continue to do your current role of being a classroom teacher, but just do it really, really well. Of course, then can you kind of expand that beyond just the reach of your classroom? So can you start taking on other teachers, mentoring them, kind of sharing your learnings, being in the teaching force with newer teachers. And I think the more you can do those types of things, I think that really helps you on the path of leadership. Now, that's not necessarily what leaders are tasked to do in systems. Like Alison's saying, oftentimes they're kind of overburdened with administrative work. And so I think there's part of a systems piece where leaders need to be encouraged to be back out of their office and into classrooms and working with teachers, because that's really what's going to improve the schools.
Alison, I ask you a different question in terms of system leadership. How do we improve it?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I actually think every teacher is a leader, because you have to be to take 30 children with you, leave alone any other colleagues. In terms of system leadership, there's been so much over the last decade that has tried to disrupt and alter this within England. So for many years, we had a local authority system whereby schools were part of their local authorities. And then suddenly there was the advent of academization. And now, interestingly, we've now got some really powerful and I think very effective groups of schools who are working as multi-academy trusts. And we have a system leadership system in England that is really quite fragmented and diverse at the moment. I think it's much better than it was even 3 years ago, because everything feels new. And as you get groups working together, they need to sort of bed down into managing to do that. And I think over the last few weeks and months of the pandemic, what we've seen is that the leaders in our system have recognized they're the ones with the authority, they're the ones with the power, they're the ones that can make the difference. Because however much is pronounced from government, actually, if you're a multi-academy trust leader and you've got 60 schools, you probably got a lot more direct influence. Well, you have, definitely. You've got a lot more direct influence over what goes on in those schools than what happens from sanctuary buildings in Westminster. So there's something about how do we make the most of that? How do we connect up the best of our multi-academy trust leaders, our leaders in church schools, for example? There are 4,000 church schools that form a network. Catholic schools, there are all kinds of different schools that have different allegiances. But I think what we're really drawn together by is what can we do that's the best we can for our communities. And that's been the factor over the last, as I say, the last little while that's really drawn all of us together, because we've had a common enemy, if you like, in COVID. And what we've been, and that's true also for these kind of global conversations, because nobody's got this sorted. Now, I've been on quite a few calls now with colleagues all over the world. And in a way, it's kind of terrifying and exhilarating at the same point, where you hear that no one's got the answer, but we're all ready to listen in a way that perhaps we haven't been in the past. We've all perhaps been a little more in our own kind of situation and not wanting to hear. I think we're much more ready to listen, to learn from each other than we were. And that's ultimate system leadership, isn't it? We think about the world in terms of education.
Sameer, do you have a comment on this?
I think one of the biggest things we can do is to select our kind of highest performing school leaders to be the systems leaders, and to select our highest performing teachers to be the school leaders. I think, I think that's kind of step number one. That's not always necessarily the case. So in some places, who gets to be the system leader has nothing to do with their performance as a teacher or in the education system. And so I think kind of thinking through that whole piece, what are the actual qualities that we need in our systems leaders? I think there's a lot of scope for improvement there, because there are some really inspiring teachers and school leaders that, if given the opportunity, can do quite a lot in these roles.
Sameer, you recently published this evidence review, if you want to call it that. And I was struck with what I read. But can you tell me what similarities and differences there are between strong school leaders across different contexts?
Yeah. So I think the biggest similarity is what Alison was mentioning earlier, is the leaders who are focused on learning are the ones that seem to be the most effective across contexts. And that's kind of no matter where you look, what the country, the school type. And briefly in terms of difference, I think we work in, say, a place like India, where there's maybe 30%, 40% of students are going to these low-cost private schools, and then the rest are going to government schools. So there, in what we're seeing in government schools, is the way that the head teachers improve quality is via working with the teachers and really developing the existing teacher workforce. Whereas in the low-cost private schools, there's a big need in the leaders being able to kind of manage the inflow of talent into the school. So how are you selecting your teachers? How are you kind of retaining the good ones? And that whole piece in the government schools, that's not necessarily falling on the school leader. So they're kind of using other mechanisms.
So thanks a lot for that, Sameer. In terms of the folks that are watching this live stream, many of these are teachers from all around the world. You've seen some of the comments that I've put up. They come from Palestine, they come from Egypt, they come from India, they come from the UK. I mean, there was a member of the Chartered College actually who said, "What a great job, Alison, you and your team do." If there was, and Alison, I come to you for this, in terms of, you have been a teacher, you've been a school leader, a principal, if there was one thing that you would tell teachers to do more of, what would it be?
To listen. We need teachers who understand their communities, understand the children that they work with, understand their colleagues. When I first became a head teacher, the school I went to was a school that had been a failing school for many years. And I told everybody that this school was now going to become a listening school. And it's so easy, I think, as a new leader to go galloping in and think that you've read some books, you've got some ideas, you just need to get on with it and sort it out. And actually, of course, you do need to be doing things and you need to be seen to doing things. But if the actions you take are related to listening to the people that you are leading, you are far more likely to have impact. So it sounds really simple, but I would say that's whether you're starting out as a teacher, whether you're a teacher already, whatever role you are, listening to the people around you is fundamental.
And Sameer, same question for you. If there was one thing a teacher watching this could do more to develop their leadership, what should it be?
I would say really focus on the needs of the students. And I think one kind of simple exercise is to just look at your class roster, pick the one student who you think you have the least chance of kind of improving, their kind of progress on, and then think about everything you need to do to work to kind of help that student in their journey. And then can you do that for all the students? Whatever services, whatever supports that student needs, is there ways for you to kind of provide that to all students?
Sameer, you've also had a very varied career in the sense that you've been in this space, but in different contexts quite a bit. So I know of your work from India, for example. What are the leadership lessons you've learned? And Alison, I'm going to ask you this question as well, so please have a think. What are the 2 or 3 leadership lessons that you have learned throughout your career that you think those that are watching may be interested in hearing?
I think one big one for me is just in really being open to ideas wherever they come from. So oftentimes we might have there's kind of, you might think of a hierarchy in an organization and feel like, okay, this person reports to this person and that person, and really ideas are everywhere. And just how do you, kind of what Alison was saying earlier, how do you really listen to everyone in an organization and make sure that you're kind of incorporating the best thoughts from everyone, I think is very important. And I think it's really important for leaders to be in touch with everyone, all their stakeholders regularly. And that's kind of one of the key things. I think the other thing is just really kind of being willing to get your hands dirty in a sense, right? So just, I work in San Francisco, even though most of our work is on the other side of the world. And kind of being able to go and be hands-on in these programs, but then having the humility to understand that you are not the expert in the room, right? There's a lot of people that know a lot more than you do, and your role as the leader is to just make sure that the expertise is channelized.
Alison, I come to you for your contribution on this.
Yeah, so I agree with you,
Alison,
Sameer.
over to you.
So I love what you're saying, Sameer. I completely agree with you about that notion of openness. But I've done research on this, and this is actually research into the leadership that was taking place in my school. I was an insider researcher together with colleagues from the University of Cambridge, and we studied what was going on. And we found that there were 3 core things that really made the difference. The first was trust, being able to trust people around you and know that they could trust you and that you would trust them. It's a reciprocal process. The second was what we described as co-agency. So if you have a sense of agency, you have a sense that your voice will be heard and that you can act upon things. Co-agency is colleagues working together, collaborating, enabling things to take place. And the third one was what the researchers termed the ethic of everybody. The idea that it was never enough to work with the majority. It was never enough to just work with, as I say, the majority. It was always about how do you include everybody? How do you find a way through? So that notion of finding a way through as a leader to tackle the most challenging issues. It's relatively straightforward, I would say, although none of leadership is really straightforward, but it's one thing to teach to the majority, lead the majority, keep the majority happy. It's another thing to constantly be driven by, how do I find a way through to help more people to understand, to be on board, to listen, to engage? How do I do that? And that work's never finished, of course, because for everybody that likes what you're saying, there's going to be someone else who might not. And so if you're going to be driven by how do I constantly try to find a way through to help them, that's hard. And what I found actually trying to work on this over many years was, in the end, sometimes I had to give up on the adults. Not, you know, I would try not to, but sometimes I had to give up on the adults. But you could never give up on the children, because that's your job as a teacher, as a school leader, is to work with the children. And however difficult they're finding life, we must never give up on them, because if we give up, who do they have next?
Alison, you know, one of the things that that I actually heard from Andreas Schleicher at the OECD was that, for example, teachers in some contexts teach too many hours. You know, the question that Kirsten was asking here is quite interesting, which is, you know, you need time in terms of to spend on these things in a meaningful way and within your contractual hours. How do you create the time to develop your leadership when you're constantly busy?
Well, there's a difference, isn't there, between busyness and productivity, I suppose. And it's about understanding yourself and understanding what are the time pressures on you, and trying to be quite disciplined about where are the times when I can actually have some good thinking time, and where are the times when I need to be actually getting on with stuff and getting my hands dirty, as Sameer described. And what I found through doing the research was I actually kept a diary. So I kept a diary, which meant that I was looking at the week ahead and what I was predicting was going to happen. What was I worrying about? What were the actions I'd got to take? What were the things on my mind, thinking about the week ahead? And then that week would take place. And then the following week, I would look back over the previous week and look and say, you know, what actually happened here? And quite often, as I started to do this, I realized that things that I was worrying about, quite often when they actually happened, weren't anything like as significant as perhaps I thought they were going to be. They sort of disappeared in terms of priority. The things that I wanted to focus on much more, and this is about self-knowledge as much as anything as a leader, I was interested in the creative things, the opportunities that meant that we could do this whole, how do we find a way through? Much less interested in the paperwork and so on. I just did that. That didn't take up a lot of time. So there's something about understanding the time that you're spending and recognizing it for what it is, and also being forgiving of yourself, because the job is impossible. I mean, it is, I realized this quite early on, it's totally impossible to be a teacher and think you can get everything sorted. I mean, you never leave your classroom at the end of the day and think, great, every book marked, every display sorted, every parent spoken to, that never happens. So what are the key things that you're going to do? And as a leader, similarly, what are the key things that you're going to make sure that you don't compromise on while you're busy doing everything else? It's a real juggling act, though.
Sameer, you smile, but I'm going to ask you that question as well. What is your research showed about how teachers actually build their toolkits given the demands on their time?
It's a real struggle, because a lot of times the teachers that we work with, the demands are not only at school, but there's a lot of demands even at home. And so I think there's a lot of onus on the people that are providing kind of professional development for teachers, and how they design those experiences. And is there ways to make those kind of bite-sized, consumable in kind of smaller segments, and kind of easier to access now that we have mobile technology is more prevalent? Is there ways to kind of utilize that to save teachers some time? I don't know if there are any golden answers. I think it's like I was saying, it's a struggle, it's a juggling act, and that's part of the inspiration that we gain every day from teachers, people that are able to have that balancing act and really thrive despite the circumstances.
Well, thanks a lot. Alison, you've been very kind and generous in terms of support for the last T4 conference that we had in May, where we had a stupendous turnout from teachers all around the world. And after that, I'm sure you're all aware that we're convening the World Education Week that takes place from the 5th to the 9th of October. That the premise is very simple. Like, whenever I've traveled around the world, I've often been astounded by the level of expertise, the passion, the specialism that schools in all parts of the world have. And it felt, because of Zoom and the culture that we're in at the moment, but because of the use of technology, we could actually peer into other classrooms and actually look at how expertise has been developed. You know, my last question to both of you, I suppose, is, and again, we've been reading all the applications, and next week we announce our 100 schools that are going to take place in our global showcase, you know, but there are also others that are asking the question in terms of how do we build teacher professionalism and expertise. I know it's a huge subject, but you know, Alison, what do you have to say about that question?
Well, it's at the heart of what we're doing at the Chartered College, because this is about expecting that as a teacher you will carry on learning throughout your career, because there is so much to know. And I think the danger comes when you think you've got it sorted. So if you find a way of achieving something in the classroom and it sort of works, and you don't change that for 25 years, well, maybe that's not optimal. So how do we make sure that we have communities of inquiry within our schools, that we make sure that people have opportunities to read, to learn, to listen, to contribute? So the Chartered College is trying very hard to provide that for people. We have teachers who publish their work in journals that go across the whole world in terms of distribution. That's amazing. That hasn't happened in England before. And we're very keen for people to join us and engage in that conversation. And we have a new website called the Education Exchange, which is a global platform. Again, and that's completely free. So anybody can join that platform, read about the things that we're talking about, watch the videos, see teachers talking from around the world, and contribute. So all of this, in the work that you're doing, Vikas, I know this is all about building this expertise. And I think we're fellow travelers on that journey, aren't we, in terms of what we're trying to do.
Well, thank you. And again, thank you for all the support that you have shown for what I've done. Sameer, do you want to have a stab at this question?
Yeah. You know, I taught for the first 7 years of my career, and I remember just the first few weeks teaching, I would come home every day almost in tears. And I think about kind of what helped me build whatever expertise I was able to build in teaching. And so much of it for me was my school principal, right? And just the way that she was able to set the conditions in the school for me to be able to be vulnerable about where I wasn't hitting the mark, and provide me support to kind of get better. And I always think back to her as kind of the kind of best first boss someone could have. And if we were able to give that to all the teachers, I think that would really go a long way in building teacher professionalism and expertise.
Well, thank you both for taking part in this live stream. Sameer, if anyone wants to learn about your work, where do they go? How do they follow you? Tell us, how do people find out more about your work? Yeah, so
our website is www.globalschoolleaders.org. So that's a nice place to get the summary. And then we're on Twitter at gschoolleaders. And that's kind of where we're putting out the latest of the programming and the research that we're doing.
And Alison, with yourselves, how do people find you?
Chartered.college.
Simple as that. And what about this new global platform?
Yeah, so if you go onto that website, we'll show you where to go to for the new global platform as well.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. There's a particular comment that's come in, Alison. There's a lot of people from the UK watching this. And so this is what they've said. I can't see their name, but I'll flash it up over here so you can see for yourself. You speak truth to power. Truth to power. Alison and Sameer, thank you so much for your time. And thank you all for tuning in. I wish you all a fantastic weekend. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, Vikas.